Ladies and gentlemen, we've been speaking about Africa a number of times today, both directly and indirectly. So for many reasons, I'm very happy to have the privilege of introducing our next speaker, Her Excellency Ambassador Tebelelo Mazile Seretse. Her Excellency assumed the position of the Ambassador of the Republic of Botswana to the United States on February 14th, 2011. Her Excellency previously served as a Member of Parliament and Cabinet under the former President of Botswana, Fetus G. Mogere, from 1999 until 2004. During that period, she held ministerial positions as Assistant Minister of Presidential Affairs, Minister of Trade, Industry, Wildlife, and Tourism, as well as Minister of Works, Transport, and Communications. Ambassador Seretse also sits on the board of several private sector representations in Botswana, including the Bank of Botswana, the Botswana Diamond Mining Company, Botswana, Botswana Insurance Holding Company, and Excess Petroleum. She has also served as director and chairperson of FSG Limited and RPC Data Limited, the largest integrated information technology service company in Botswana. Additionally, Ambassador Seretse was head of the African delegation for the 4th World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference in Doha in 2001. Her lecture topic today is Emerging Africa, the Case of Botswana's Democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a very, very warm welcome for Her Excellency, Ambassador Tebelelo Mazile Seretse. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all of you. Although the topic is talking about emerging Africa, what I would wish for you today is to know that there is no such a thing called Africa. To continue to talk about Africa clouds our academia. It also, when we are talking about culture, makes Africa seem as if it is homogeneous. The tendency, particularly and especially here in the United States, is to take the map of the United States and to superimpose it on Africa, or the other way around, and then talk about Africa. Perhaps the challenge and the problem is that we do not have a U.S. policy towards Botswana, or a U.S. policy towards Nigeria, or a U.S. policy towards Ghana. We talk about a U.S. policy towards Africa, which for us, as educated people in the room, we should really start talking about the individual countries. The individual countries, because from a cultural point of view, the cultures of these countries are so diverse that if today I visit Ghana or I visit Nigeria, I'm just as a stranger as yourself from the United States or from the UK. So I would encourage us to start learning, sometimes from a cultural point of view. I think my generation, and probably a generation below, we are a lost hope. So maybe we can pin our progress on the younger generation by having cultural exchanges, by having educational tours. One gets very disappointed when you hear that here in the United States, you have leaders. And when I say leaders, I'm talking about congressmen and women. I'm talking about senators who do not have passports. Gone are the days that the U.S. was the beginning and the end it all. Other countries are emerging, so we need to broaden ourselves. When we talk about cultural democracy, diplomacy, as I have already said, we need education. I think education, more than anything else, is the most important thing which moves any and every country from point A to point B. The 53, 54 African countries are no exception. They need to concentrate on education. They need to teach their people that globalization doesn't choose. It's going to come to you. But also globalization can also be deemed a risk, because globalization doesn't always bring good with it. So to that extent, when we are talking about risks, one can also take globalization as a risk. We can also look at markets as a risk, because globalization have made us mobile and our investments mobile to the extent that you can buy shares on the NASDAQ even when you are here. What happens on that stock exchange market, or if I am in Botswana and I buy shares at the New York Stock Exchange, is going to affect and have a ripple effect. So the markets can also lead to a global risk, as in the same way as globalization itself. And of course, obviously, terrorism also is one area which can also lead to risks. Now, when we're talking about security and national security, it is also multifaceted, because every state is sovereign. And when the sovereignty of a country is challenged by any other country or by any happenings in it, that results in a security risk. Interference in that sovereignty by persuasion or by force can also threaten the security and political and economic. And another new one, which also is a result of globalization, cyber security, because you could get also your data corrupted, or you could think you have confidentiality as sovereignty allows you to, and you hardly have any. So I thought, before I concentrate on the topic and the case of Botswana, I will just touch on those to put in perspective some of the things that we are talking about. The stories which always come out of the continent of Africa are always sad and horrible stories. Correctly so, because globalization makes it a point that good news is no news. So the good news is never told. It's sensationalism and it's negativity. And with people who don't travel, it is an added risk, because then they don't know any better. And then they become extremely vulnerable to what one sees in the news. When the so-called Arab Spring arose in the northern part of Africa, and it was neither spring in those countries either when it started, conclusions were very quickly drawn to say that, look at what is happening in Africa. Next country is going to be so and so. Next country is going to be so and so. Predictions. Well, when you look at countries like Botswana, which have a teledensity of 98%, teledensity, the measure of how telecommunication is spread out throughout the country, there is also forgetting that countries like Botswana were democracies before they gained independence. Often scholars and associate democracy and independence and tie them together. That also forgets the culture of the people. Luckily for Botswana, the culture of the people and the ways of the people was democratic before gaining independence. That is why when often we are asked the question, why don't other countries follow the Botswana model? Our quick answer is always, maybe it is not their culture. What do I mean when I say that Botswana was democratic before it got independence? Maybe before I even go there. Let me explain that Botswana was a British colony by choice. A lot of the African countries, colonialization was imposed on them. For Botswana's case, with Botswana, which was then called Bechuana land, when you look at the old maps, which has never really been Bechuana land. It was just the British not knowing how to pronounce Botswana. So to them, Botswana sounded like Bechuana. So they wrote on the old maps, Bechuana land, the land of the Bechuana, when they were trying to say the land of the Botswana or the land of the Botswana. People from Botswana are called Botswana. You just look at the country and instead of B-O, you say B-A. And that is the name of the people. The language is S-E Tswana, Setswana, Botswana. One person, Motswana, M-O. You see how easy the language is. I could teach it to you in 10 minutes. But anyway, fearing to be annexed into South Africa, they went to Britain and said, please protect us. The British people didn't know what the then chiefs were fussing about, but they were gracious enough to protect us. Come the 60s, went back to them and said, we are ready for self-governance. They said, au revoir. Little did they know that we had discovered diamonds, because I always say, hey, that was the biggest mistake that they made. Had they known that they were diamonds, they wouldn't have gone anywhere. And true to them, thanking them for the protection and thanking them for the relationship that endures today between Britain and Botswana in the same way that we enjoy a good relationship with the United States. They didn't do any development. In Botswana, there is no historic school, no historic hospital, no historic road that one can be shown to say, this we inherited from our colonial masters. So if you go to Botswana, anything and everything that you see there was developed by the Botswana people themselves. But Botswana, it's also a miracle country, because this is why we call it the jewel of Africa. It is the only country to hold the world record, to have grown at the rate of 6% and above for 40 years, continuous, uninterrupted. This is why when we hear people saying diamonds are bad, they are blood diamonds, they are not to be bought, the one-line story of the young Nigerian girl who has done a presentation called The One-Line Story, Chichimbe. Diamonds have made Botswana what they are. We call them development diamonds. Botswana is the most peaceful country on the African continent. It also holds the record for being the least corrupt country on the African continent. When it comes to the Global Peace Index, which is the index which is used to measure how safe a country is, Botswana is a miracle country which beats the United States. Whilst we rank in the 30s in terms of the Global Peace Index, the US ranks in the 60s. Now, globalization, Google it. We often talk about corruption in Africa and talk about Africa without saying which of the African countries. But we also forget to say who are the corruptors. The question that I always beg to answer is, are the Africans the ones with the money to corrupt? Or is the people who are coming from outside and the companies which are corrupting? And if they are in fact found to have been corrupting, what do their parent countries do? What legislation do they put in place so that this global risk of corruption, because it's a fact that it is a risk, what do we do about it? Today, the Bretton Woods institutions state that the growth is going to come from the African continent, from sub-Saharan Africa. Normally, from an economic point of view, we look at a growth rate of 2% as an excellent growth. That's what the developing countries use as a measure, an economic measure. A lot of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa are going to be growing by 5% or better. Not only that, I often ask people, how old is the United States? Does anyone in my audience know? How old is the United States? 200 plus. Yeah. 200 plus. Don't know the maths. I don't know why people have never known this. My country, I know how old my country is. 2016 will be turning 50 years old. A lot of the African countries are young democracies. So, as young democracies, their challenges are going to be greater than old established democracies. It's just part of common sense. A child has more problem than a grown-up. What a child sees as unsolvable, an adult with good common sense finds a solution to it. So we are pleased as Africa, reluctant to talk about Africa as I am, but we are pleased about Africa. Not only that, we are even pleased about the Arab Spring, if it was spring, because it shows a people want democracy to be in place. And unless you have democracy, you cannot even start to talk about culture. You cannot even start to talk about diplomacy. So here is a people who are determined that we are going to take self-rule. We are going to have the rule of law. We are going to observe the various freedoms which the rest of the world endures. Unfortunately, there is never anyone who looks at it from a positive angle. Yet, from an investment point of view, where there is chaos, there is growth in terms of investment. So when you find the big firms and you say, why don't you go to a peaceful country? When I studied economics, I was told that FDI, foreign direct investment, would flow into a country which has the rule of law, democracy, lack of corruption, all the institutions in place, there is transparency, accountability. In Botswana, as much as we may not be the best, we have met all of those. We don't see FDIs coming in. And part of the reason is because we are peaceful. Something to think about. So, what am I saying? I'm saying that from Botswana point of view, we were democratic before we became independent. We have an institution called the Kgotla. I don't have an English word for it. It's KGOTLA. It is, for lack of better explanation, like a court. Where there is plaintiff, there is defendant. Anyone and everyone can participate in the Kgotla. Not selected, not like a jury. And the plaintiff would state their case, defendant would state their case. All of us, as participants, we will start commenting on whether the case is for the defendant or for the plaintiff and state the reasons why. And the chief presides over the Kgotla. In each and every town in Botswana, in each and every village in Botswana, there are Kgotlas, 10, 20. People use them for dispute resolutions. When we became so-called modern or independent, the government then used the Kgotla for consultation. So the ministers of government, Secretary of Education, Secretary of Commerce, would go there when they have a policy wanting to introduce something. The president will also go there. When there is a call in the village, there's a Kgotla meeting, everybody goes to the Kgotla. My late mother, whenever I used to go home sometimes, and I will get home and I say, oh, where's Dad? My mom would say to me, oh, he's gone to the library. And for the first time I heard it, library? What would an old man be doing at the library? And my mother said, oh, my daughter, you don't know. Us here in the village, the Kgotla is our library. That's where we go to learn about what government is doing. That's where we go to learn about anything which affects us in the society. So my late mother called the Kgotla a library. Now, at the Kgotla, anyone, yourself even as a visitor, yourself even not knowing the indigenous language, you can speak in English. We speak two languages, English and Setswana. You can get up and say, Mr. President, I don't agree with that policy. And these are the reasons why I don't agree with it. So when we then wrote our constitutions and talked about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, tolerance of a different point of view, is because it was already been practiced as our culture, which for a lot of African countries which were colonized or where colonization was forced on them, I am sure they must have had similar structures which were destroyed. We were fortunate because we were a colony which was insignificant, and we managed to retain what we thought was good about our culture. Now, in the Kgotla, you have absolute protection. There is no one who is going to shut you down or who is going to say to you, you are a peasant, or you are not educated, or your point is not valid. Everyone is given a right of say. And it is that freedom that has enriched our democracy, and it is entrenched. This is why somebody who would make an unknown statement of saying what is happening in Egypt is going to go down, next is going to go down, we'll see it in South Africa, we'll see it in... You have to look at the culture of a people. How is their dispute resolution? How do they carry themselves given whatever issue? So the issue of chieftainship we have retained. We have tribes in Botswana, but we are united by a language. I speak 2 languages in Botswana. My colleague Innocent speaks 2 or 3 others, but almost everybody in Botswana can speak the same language. You would know that when you go to certain African countries, I want to pick Nigeria as an example, they would have to communicate in English because they can't speak each other's indigenous language. This is how they also Pidgin English, which has become an English now, has evolved as a means of ease of communication. We have separation of powers, which have the checks and balances akin to the British model, akin to yours here, the judiciary, legislature, executive, which check on each other. We have opposition parties, but the ruling party has been dominant. Other people see that as bad, but the problem is that where the government is providing free education, from primary to university, where government is looking after the poor, where government is providing free health care, including HIV/AIDS medication, antiretrovirals. Yes, you are going to oppose, but really, what are you going to oppose much about? This is why people would go out of the party, go to this one, they move again. They go with their seat. We formed an independent electoral commission, and we have a free press and media. Most of the newspapers are owned by the private press. We have civil society. And because we encourage criticisms, people in Botswana are vocal. They are vocal, but in a respecting and orderly way, because it's also part of our culture. And we have respect for the rule of law and human rights. So, in conclusion, therefore, what I'm saying is that yes, we need cultural diplomacy. DC tourism, they do a brilliant job in moving around with us as embassies, getting us to open our embassies, to educate the people about our differences, to share with them about our culture. But all this would mean nothing if we don't move and appreciate our differences and find solidarity in our differences and respect for each other, culture, for each other's preferences, and for each other's way of life. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm ready to take questions.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I see the first question has already begun.
I can take 2-3 questions at a time.
2 or 3? Okay.
Yeah.
By the way, the ambassador of Sierra Leone has requested that we reschedule the lecture, so meaning that we, from our side, do have a few more minutes if you'd like to take questions. And then probably on the 28th, we'll have the ambassador of Sierra Leone. We're still trying to figure out the timing. Just one small change from the timetable I forgot to announce. Please.
Mine is not a question, but a comment.
Thank you, sir.
My name is Zeke Botokuma, Madam Ambassador. I have to confess that in less than 1 year, it's the second time I had the opportunity to listen to you. And I loved everything you said, because as an African born, or more precisely, because Africa is diverse, as you said, as a Congolese born, living in the US and a US citizen, it's always a pleasure to see somebody from the continent saying something positive about the continent, about which there are so many negativities. And I loved everything you said when you came to Morgan State University less than a year ago. And once again, I had the chance to listen to you, so I was very happy that I had the second chance to listen to you. Something about the ambassador, whom I don't know really well, besides the 2 meetings at which I was at Morgan and now here. About Morgan, the ambassador came as a guest, and after her speech, she brought all kinds of goodies to give to Morgan State University. And you don't see that very often. And I think that was a good example of cultural diplomacy from an African, from an excellent ambassador from Botswana. Okay, that's my comment.
Thank you. I'll take another comment.
Additional comments or questions? Okay, please.
Thank you, Your Excellency. My name is Basma Etribi, and I'm from Egypt. I'm a graduate student in international relations at the American University in Cairo. And I really applaud your speech with regards to the positive scenarios that exist in Africa, especially with a country that was privileged enough not to be caught in the middle of colonization and not to be known of its privileges and its pluses. And my country wasn't that fortunate enough. And with colonization. But such a scenario would, I think, give me hope with what's going on in my country nowadays. With democracy not being that part or that enriched and entrenched in the society, it gives us hope for more subtle transformation, I believe, especially with different factions, not only Islamist, but also liberals, not finding themselves in the grassroots of the society. At the same time that there is this sort of not only hope, but there could be a plan for peace to be integrated while having a fully functioning democracy and having economic development. Again, I'd like to emphasize on the fact that the not being known for your pluses as a country in a developing world is a privilege. So having not having the attention, I think that was one of the not only the blessings that you had, but you were behind the headlines, and having peace at your country doesn't give you that much FDI. It's on the contrary to every other country in the Middle East, especially as an Arab and as a Muslim, who I'm telling you that it's not that much of a privilege to have chaos all the time. So it's more or less either peace or instability. I think being part of the developing world is not as easy as the previous ambassadors were talking about, of having a plan and speaking that much, or talking that it's subtle or it's easy to talk about these things in DC. But being part of development in a developing country makes it way much harder to put things on the ground than just talking or rhetoric about applause or Pope in the future. So I really applaud your speech. And for me, I was like, I enjoyed every single second of it. And I really appreciate your talk. Thank you so much for your time.
Yes, thank you. I think also what we must put in perspective also is the issue of management. When you have a staff complement of 40 people in your office versus another manager who has a staff complement of 6 people, it's generally easier to manage the 6 people. Now, from a practical point of view, the population of Botswana is 2 million compared to the population of how many? 80 million. And Botswana, it's more homogeneous than unhomogeneous. I think at least 80% of the people are Christians, and freedom of religion is encouraged, it's practiced, it's entrenched in the constitution. So although there are many, many churches in Botswana, but the majority of the people are Christians, which means the values also don't clash. Unlike a lot of other African countries which have, religions which have different cultures also, but which need to be taken on the same platform. At independence in 1966, Botswana was the 3rd poorest country in the world. Today, it has the highest GDP of about 14,000 US dollars in Africa. And Moody's and Standard & Poor's, your economic institutions, rank it A for investment safety. But I've had an opportunity at least to visit Egypt twice when things were normal. And we need to sort of guard ourselves also as world leaders to say, at what point do we discourage dictatorship? That is a very important point, because you would have one person ruling for 20 years and the so-called superpowers are working with that government and they don't find anything wrong with it, when in fact they ought to have been, because by then the magnitude and the challenge of the problem might not have been to this extent. It might have been to a reduced level. So we need to not only be driven economically, maybe looking at a country like Libya, to say what is it that we are benefiting to allow perpetuation of abuse of human rights until our voices are heard as a people, as leaders. So we get challenged also when smaller countries like Botswana, which given the Libya issue, was one of the countries to expel the Libyan ambassador out of the country even before the United States took action. So we need to guard, because at the end of the day, democracy has no color. And democracy and observance of the rule of law and lack of abuses of human rights, we should not spare anyone in the world given those abuses. The minimum that we could do is to talk so that problems are controlled timeously and the interventions are done immediately. And of course, now taking and wearing my gender hat, the people who suffer the most are the women and the children. One would hope that when you look at African countries like Rwanda, which have recorded the worst genocide ever known to men in the modern history, but today which holds the highest record of female participation in governance, that we would encourage that so that hopefully the women would bring soft democracy and soft touch to governance, so that we then can talk about participatory democracy as opposed to just democracy. So all of us are looking and praying hard for countries which have had upheavals, because they are part of our own, and the people who suffer there are our people. So we need to all be looking to say, how do we help to speed up? The cellular phone, which was made by globalization to start upheavals, how do we turn around and find positivity of the same cellular phone to bring peace? Thank you for the observance about Morgan State. I graduated from Morgan State class of 78. I was a double major, economics and accounting. And I always say that I'm a Baltimore girl right here from next door. And I credit whatever my achievements, not my shortfalls, but whatever my achievements, I credit it to the grounding that I got from Morgan State University. I then went further to University of Cincinnati, and recently Morgan State awarded me an honorary doctorate, which I hold dear to my heart. Yes.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions. I think you are next.
Your Excellency, Ambassador Tebelelo Mazile of the
Sir.
Republic of Botswana in the United States, we are very honored and privileged to having you today. And I am Ozzy Romeo, Arizona State University, Associate Facilitator of USPSANA, which is an academic organization working with the United Nations to achieve the MDGs. I have to say I'm really impressed from what you said, and in line with Dr. Zeke and my former, what is your name again? Masma, I'm really joining them to say thank you so much for the amazing speech, and also of speaking truly from the perspective of our continent. I feel all the time offended when I'm at the university, Department of Psychology, having people around the table talking about Africa and saying, instead of specifying a country which they're interested in, they will say people from Africa, or I want to go to Africa, or this and that. I always feel offended. I would say, personally, I went to Cameroon, my country of origin, with another associate facilitator called the writing of the organization. We met with the Minister of Youth and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cameroon. Before meeting with the ministers, they asked me 5 minutes of discussion before meeting with the guests from the US. They told me, we are a sovereign country, and people should respect our sovereignty and our constitution. It is not because we are in the need of cooperation that we should always subdue to people thinking. In looking at the reports, when I was also in the Gambia, the information given abroad about this country was completely wrong. When my colleague went back from Cameroon to the US, he told me he was not sure, he never knew he can have fun in Africa or in Cameroon in particular. We need somehow to create a situation where we really work hard to change the system, which is strongly institutional since the colonial time. Secondly, I would say there is a lack of role models in Africa telling the truth and telling people what they need to hear. And having you today telling this is something very interesting, because even what they call the Arab Spring is also a lot of wonderful excuse people are using to express what they think about the continent. But we need somehow to have people who have the courage to say what the truth is and to educate the generation to make sure that tomorrow people know what the reality is and continue working towards building peace in the society. Thank you very much. And I would like to have your recommendation or your suggestion how to do in terms of working hard to stand against the system that has the tendency to show how negative things or bad things come from others and the others are just perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You are not going to get anyone really doing damage control for us. It has to be us, the enlightened, the well-traveled, the well-read. And when people talk about Africa, instead of getting offended, get educational, sit them down and educate them. That would also be part of diplomacy. And you would be surprised about what appreciation you will get for enlightening anybody. I always say to people, if you move around in a day and you don't learn at least one thing, then know that you are not alive. You are not living. That one thing might just be discovery. Oh, Massachusetts Avenue goes this way and the other one crosses it at this point. So I think people are thirsty for learning. The MDGs and the peer review mechanism, luckily for us in Botswana, we are meeting a lot of them because that was part already of our Vision 2016. 2016 is a vision which we crafted some time back because by the year 2016, we will be 50 years old as a country. So the question was asked of every Botswana to say, when we are 50 years old, what kind of Botswana would you like to see? And people said a healthy one, a compassionate one, a secure one. So the government started working on what we call the pillars of the vision. We are just almost about achieved it. Now we have engaged what we call an excellence strategy, and an excellence strategy to push to be the best in this, to be the best in that. And we have what we call the hubs, HUBS, education hub, innovation hub, health, transport. How do we connect this landlocked country to all over by building railways through Namibia and that kind of thing? You are saying a very interesting thing. Have you ever stopped to wonder that a country so rich, a continent so rich in culture, so rich in warmth, so rich in humility, how could that continent have been called a dark continent? Today, there isn't a single resource that one cannot find in Africa. Not a single one. So, how did historians tell us that we were uncivilized, we were barbaric? And how did it happen that we even accepted it in the first place? So, education, education, education. Because education firstly gives mobility. But education, even to the person you meet on the street, and they say, hello, you are from Africa. And you say, no, I'm not from Africa, I'm from Cameroon. Cameroon is a country which shares this border. But Cameroon has one of the best soccer teams. You know, that education. And for me, I also say Botswana has the most beautiful women in the world. You know, 1999, we were Miss Universe. Last year, our girl was first princess of Miss World. You know, and people say, oh, really? So, education. And our cooperating partners to also say, please continue to educate. All of us can be role models by efficiency, by doing well what we do, by surpassing the expectations of anybody and everybody. So let us fold our jackets, go out there, get to work. The diaspora, an article was done, I think it was in the Times, calculating to say the money of the diaspora, if it was to go back and be infused in the continent, how diverse and how rich we can be. Free trade, let us start taking away the trade barriers. Let us look at the indices of doing business in our individual countries and say, what do we need to do in our EPAs, our economic blocks? What do we need to do? And also look at the models which work good for us. You know, UK at some time was subsidizing agriculture such that they even would buy milk and throw it away because they didn't know anything about what to do with it. And if you go to World Trade Organization and you hear the talk against subsidy, you'll get shocked. There's no country which has developed agricultural sector without subsidy. I don't know any. So we need to say what model, learn what it is that we are being taught, and say now what is the practical, what is the model which work in our situation. When I was learning economics, I was told that when you have excess liquidity in a country, you know, you will borrow, easy to do things. We had excess liquidity in Botswana, and the central bank became a deposit taker of last resort, as opposed to the role that we learned that a central bank is lender of last resort. So let us find the things which work for our circumstances and apply them. Thank you.
I think there was... Okay. There was one final question here. If we keep it brief, if possible.
Yes,
do you have a few more minutes?
Fine. Yeah. I will take
Okay,
that.
just a brief question and a brief response.
Say.
Your Excellency, thank you very much. Chris is my name again from Nigeria. Mine is not a question because I'm really overwhelmed by your presentation. You know, before Africa started gaining their independence and stuff like freedom, as they may define it, we have this burning, this passion of Pan-Africanism, which the likes of the Ziks of Nigeria, the Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere and co. exhibited. And truly, while you're speaking, I'm being moved by goose pimples. I feel all those flashes. I feel all those things. I must appreciate you for that. But what I really want to say here, it is not now. I am thinking about the future. Because there is a great disconnection between our elites and the youth. I run a young organization called African Youth Initiative on Crime Prevention. Each time we carry out programs, I see the disconnection. I see where the elites, as the ambassador who is now in Washington, is. And I see the African youth who will be in the streets of Botswana, in the streets of Nigeria, Cameroon. I see where you see the wide barrier demarcation. Question is, what is this strategy? Because this cultural bonding, this diplomatic bonding will never take place when the young people are not getting the facts. You just told us something here. I've never heard about it before. Without being immodest, I think most of the youths in Botswana, they've not heard what you just said. That is the disconnection. Is, if I may say, in Nigeria, we move with siren. And when you hear siren, you know what it means. Because if you are by the way, anything can happen. I didn't say the cemetery may be your last place. But the most important thing is we should cut this demarcation, bridge this gap, so that young people will start seeing these values. And by seeing these values, living these values, preaching these values, you see that Africa will have a better society. I'm not overwhelmed. I don't live in the States. I don't live here. I've traveled wide. I live in Lagos. I came from Lagos. At times, if you tell, I went to Japan, in Tokyo, and I was telling friends that, hey, I'll be going back. They say, what? You mad? You came here, you say, I'll be leaving back immediately after my program. They say, what? You going back? I think you have something to tell us. That there is a particular thing the West are coming to Africa for. I was asking Ambassador Johnny Carson last week during the African Young Innovative Summit. I said, why is it that you without wasting much of your time, Nicolas Sarkozy from France threw the first missile and it landed in Tripoli. But we have seen the Robert Mugabe's, we have seen the Sudanese and stuff like that. Can you define this your decision taking? And there is no answer. That shows that we are peculiar as a people. We have what makes us tick. And young people need to hear this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me take the lady behind you and then the gentleman. Those should be the last.
All right, that's
If
very
you
brief, just because
allow
we're about
me,
15 minutes past.
Yes, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Seretse. My name is Bridget Thibault. I'm from the University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth, and I just want to thank you again. I mean, all of us are really impressed about what you just said. I'm particularly concerned or touched by your comment on the corrupt nature of African governments, and I totally agree with what you said in terms of that corruption or who is the corrupted. And as a teacher, I usually ask the same question of my students, because that is the first thing that they say about African countries. Governments are corrupt, everybody is corrupt. And I said, well, this is a research topic for you. Go find out who is corrupting African governments, because if you say Africans are inherently poor, then there is a problem. How do we explain how a continent so rich in all kinds of resources can have the poorest people on earth? That is your assignment. So that is really something that I like about that. The other thing is that I'm particularly happy that you talked about the initiatives that various institutions can have to promote peace, to promote collaborations, because that is what really African nations need to do. And in terms of those US policies towards Africa, it is part of that frustration that the policies are quote unquote lumped together. And when we have those dictators that have been in power forever, taking out resources that could be used by African people, then leaving those who need to be taken out, it becomes a problem. And so we need to revisit those strategies. We need to, someone in your status, at your meetings, you need to re-emphasize those points. The example that you gave of Botswana, for instance, with a leadership that is strong, that is supportive of the people. We don't need people like that or governments like that to leave quickly because they engage a quote-unquote development plan that works. But for those others that do not do anything, and that everybody knows they are corrupt, but yet we still work with them, we support them, it means there is that what's in it for me. So we keep them there for a reason. And so I just want to applaud you and thank you again for your speech.
Thank you, Bridget.
Yeah. Hello.
Hi.
Good morning or
Good
afternoon,
afternoon.
please.
Good afternoon.
Actually, I'm Adebwale from Nigeria. I'm a Nigerian, but I stay in the eastern part of Europe. Actually, my question is very simple. We've always been talking, because each time they talk about Africa, we always like try to ask a lot of questions. People like to actually ask and think of a lot of things, and what we actually do is we find it so difficult to reach a conclusion, and but in some areas we try to just believe that, okay, this person has actually given us where we're going. Actually, my question is actually an honor to see you here as an ambassador and as a serving ambassador. Actually, my question is very simple, because I think I've actually worked with one or two Nigerian ambassador. My question is this: if you look at the connection between the people back home and people in diaspora, I think as someone has actually said earlier, that the connection is kind of very big and is not that closer. My question still goes to the embassies, let's say to the ambassadors, that what have they been doing to the problems of to the problem Africa are facing right now? And because if you look at the connections of the Europes, let's say, let me use the United States as an example. If there's going to be a connection between them and the African countries, you say their first step will always be their ambassadors. You understand? But let me say what is happening in African countries, let's say the African continent, the ambassadors are kind of like, maybe when they get here, the way I see things is they focus more on business than what they are here to do. Let us be factual in some sense. But if we're going to try and understand something, if they can actually enlighten the government on what they should do, on economic policies they should follow, on what kind of things they should give to to people abroad, or what kind of contracts they should actually give to them to do, I think that we that will solve our problem a little bit. Thank you.
Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. The question is, what do the ambassadors do? We are probably here just holidaying, but we do work quite a lot. Firstly, the ambassadors educate about their countries, and all the ambassadors, they are concerned about employment creation back in their countries. So because of that concern of unemployment, also believing that employment can make people independent, we talk to different companies to encourage them to look at our countries for investment. We also talk to different schools, universities, to try and have partnerships. And there we are again looking at the youth to try and have agreements with our universities at home, or to come and partner with the universities or the institutions at home. It would be pleasing to you to know that as African ambassadors, we meet here in Washington. We have a meeting that we hold once a month as total African ambassadors. If for one reason the ambassador is not in, or gone to headquarters, or for whatever reason, or gone to another state, they usually send people from their embassies to represent them at that meeting. So we have this organized groupings. But I think what we need to do is at that groupings to talk about the gap which is being talked about, which we have not talked about. The gap, or the perceived gap, between the elite and the people. You will also know that over and above meeting as African ambassadors, we also meet in our regions. Like Nigeria, they have a very powerful meeting of ECOWAS. So they meet as ECOWAS. In Southern Africa, we meet as SADC, Southern African Development Community. Those meetings are also monthly. So we do interact. You would know that all the ambassadors, particularly ambassadors of AGOA qualified countries, African Growth Opportunity Act, we've been lobbying Congress and Senate and basically staying there, requesting for AGOA to be renewed, that country fabric and all of that. So yes, we do party because partying is part of diplomacy. But let me assure you that we also work very hard. I just actually finished organizing the Africa Day events. I was one of the chairpersons, and there we had regional debates about issues which concern us. In SADC, which I was also party to, we talked about food security, we talked about tourism and aviation, we talked about mining and beneficiation. So those are some of the topics. And we talked those topics with some of the stakeholders in this country. So yes, it's difficult, but yes, we make headways. When I borrow my brother's point here, you will also know that when companies and government officials go to our countries from this country, we organize for them to see the ministers. Here, we hardly see ministers. You probably wait 6 months if you are lucky to see a minister. But when they go to our capital, when they, believe you me, we run. We make sure they see the minister of this, the minister of that, the president, if it is necessary. So one would hope that diplomacy would grow to reciprocacy. Because when we start doing that, the AGOA ministers were asking, where are our counterparts? We came here, we are told that we are going to meet the legislators. We are meeting the staffers. Where are our counterparts? So when that reciprocacy, and that reciprocacy is going to be helped by having a policy with Nigeria. Thank you, Bridget, for the comments that you make on corruption. What pleases me about corruption is that when you look at the Transparency International scales, you see improvement. You see countries putting laws, taking action. So, yes, it is important that it is corruption, but it is also important with what are we doing about it? Is the country making an effort to rid itself of corruption? Are they putting legislation? Are they putting independent institutions which could help to do that? And yes, a lot of the countries are doing that. I talked about globalization and the age of the internet as also a risk. But to reduce the gap, we can also use globalization, because one of the things that we can do to reduce this gap is that you can connect and we can talk to somebody in Nigeria. You can take your youth organizations, put them somewhere, say, Ambassador in Washington, I want you today to lecture to this youth. So you don't need to fly to Nigeria anymore to say. So we can use this technology for empowering and for mentoring and for preaching the correct message to the youth. Luckily for us, for Botswana, our president is very passionate about the youth, and introduces things like sports to get them busy. The ones who are unemployed ask ministries and the private sector to mentor them, even if they are not giving them a full salary, just some allowance so that they can also build up their CVs. So we need to look and understand first and foremost, what do the youth want? During my time, if I was to tell my parents that I'm going to study music or fashion, my mother would have said, you are crazy, not me paying the school fees. We looked at these things as not career. If you said you are going to do law, medicine, it was like, that's my girl, But now we need to open our minds and say, if somebody says, I want to do art, encourage them and facilitate for them so that they can do the art in the way they understand. If somebody says, I want to be a dancer, facilitate so that they can learn that. You will also see that that would automatically also reduce employment. Not only that, it will lead to perfection because people are then doing the things that they really want to be studying. But I think we need to move away of this imposing what we think it ought to be. And to commend you, crime prevention is one of the challenges all over. We need to get our children out of the streets, educate them. And we are here in Washington. I can talk to the youth in Nigeria from here. I don't have to be a Nigerian to talk to the youth in Kenya. A Nigerian ambassador can also talk to the youth in Botswana. So because we have these meetings, we can also target and try to use modern technology to empower our people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thank you very much.